conference, the 2015 NoPassport Theater Conference. The 2014 NoPassport Theater Conference was here last year. But today we're just doing a kind of a remote satellite version of that in your class with some amazing performance artists and theater artists that do docudrama and performance activism at Missouri State University. Her primary focus prior to graduate school has been working with youth theater companies to expand performance opportunities to children and communities without arts funding and exposure, exploring creation of work with underserved youth and using theater arts to teach life skills and incite change. And Addie is here to talk about the recent production of The Good Body by Eve Ensler.
Hey guys. So we wanted to bring this in and talk a little bit about The Good Body, which was, as Eric said, Eve Ensler's follow-up piece to the Vagina Monologues. And this is a really good example of what docudrama is because she did do interviews with several women to create this piece. And originally it's written kind of like she did for the Vagina Monologues, where she was the only actor and played all of the characters and herself. So the difference between this show and the Vagina Monologues is there is the character of Eve who sort of threads the stories together and goes on this journey with them. But what I did with the production, we paired with STAR, which is the Sexual Trauma Awareness Resource Center in town. And this was one of their fundraisers for bringing in money for their organization. So they approached us last year after we did this with Swine Palace and asked me to do it again this year. And originally it was an opportunity for the MFA actors to do something because 3 of us had not been cast in a show and we wanted to do work. But after getting the opportunity to perform it once, it was really nice to revisit again this year because I really do think it has a lot of appeal and an opportunity to showcase women in theater, especially because a lot of the characters in theater are in service to some other need, primarily because a lot of our theater is done with a male point of view, or the male being the focus and women being a subservient role to further their journey. So it's really interesting to do this play that is potentially feminist theater because it's written by a woman with only women characters in it, but they're real people that have been transformed into characters in a play. So the way that I took it and did it, instead of casting 12 different women and then someone to play Eve, I had 5. And I had all of the women in my show play part of Eve, so they transformed and took on the role of Eve. Because it is a story of sort of like every woman. So each of these, I guess it's 10 women, not 12, I'm sorry. 10 women go on a journey and tell their stories about how in some ways they have felt oppression based on what social pressures are to look, to be, to act, what a character of a woman is supposed to be in our society. And I had 5 really talented women play those roles. So they did a lot of different characters, not necessarily their type. Playing women from India, from LA, from Italy, and transforming through their work as theater artists to bring these characters to life, as well as playing Eve. So it was a really lovely experience to get to see these women go through these journeys and work to thread it together by having them all take on the role of Eve, who is sort of narrating what the experience is from an outside perspective and bringing some clarity to what she's hearing from these women. Anything else you want to say about that?
No, that's a great introduction.
Cool.
Yeah, we'll come back to it for sure.
Great.
Okay. So our next performance artist is Antonio Garza. And Antonio is a writer and performer from the South Texas Mexican border. He writes essays and chronicles which have appeared in journals and magazines on both sides of the river. His essay on attending a bullfight with vegetarian friends won an AWP award. Garza has performed in Men in Uniform, his one-person show about his experience with the wrongful arrest by a U.S. Border Patrol agent after 9/11. And then it's also, this performance, Men in Uniform, has also toured theaters and festivals in this country and in France. He is currently at work on Mexican's Guide to the Middle East, a show about his time in the occupied territories of Palestine, and looks at daily interactions through frontera-colored glasses. Antonio Garza is most at home in New Orleans, where he is the founder of Amigos, de los Amigos, a parading organization founded after Katrina. He is also a founding member of the parading organization Crew Delusion. Antonio teaches in the intensive English language program at the University of New Orleans. He also fixes houses.
Hi, so my name is Antonio Garza, and I'll start talking about something that pertains to your docudrama class, which is my show Men in Uniform, which began because in two separate incidents after 9/11, I was living in El Paso, Texas, just miles from the border. I was wrongfully arrested by a U.S. Border Patrol agent, which left me for a very long period of time with a lot of questions. One of them, why me? And as opposed to shows that interview or theater that interviews people from the outside, I was just interrogating myself as I had been interrogated. But and the show began with that question: why was I arrested by a U.S. Border Patrol agent? It started off as an essay, and there's something to confrontation that leads you to want to do something outside of the page where you just repeat things. So, and later talking about microaggression or aggression and theater, I think there's something to be said for that. But in the show, in reenacting scenes, it's a very different process than doing it with dialogue on a piece of paper. I don't work with a script, so the French meaning of essay is to try. And unlike in an essay, I was able to try in different venues, different forms, what it is I wanted to highlight, depending on who was in the audience. And so that speaks to that part of docudrama. And maybe in the second part, I will talk about the Amigos de los Amigos, which is a parading organization that started after Katrina, that began with the question of what is it to make a parade with a Mexican theme in New Orleans, Louisiana, and how do you find the historical grab for that being that there was a famous Mexican president who was in exile as a laborer, Benito Juarez. So, yeah, we'll use that as the introduction.
Okay, great. Okay. Our next performance artist, theater artist, and playwright is A Scribe Called Quess. Quess is a poet, educator, actor, and playwright in that order. He is a two-time National Slam Poetry Champion, title winner, and founding member of Team Snow, Slam New Orleans. New Orleans is three-time National Championship title-winning Slam poetry team. His accomplishments with Team Snow have earned him honors from the Mayor of New Orleans as well as City Council. His writing and work with youth as a poet has led him to the classroom where he has served 6 years as an educator. As a theater maker, Quess has written and acted in productions with Junebug Productions, Art Spot Productions, and Urban Bushwomen. In the summer of 2014, he was awarded a residency at the Contemporary Arts Center as part of the inaugural class of the Distillery, whereby he workshopped his first stage play, Crossroads, which is slated for release in early 2016. He has self-produced a self-titled CD, A Scribe Called Quess, and his debut book of poetry, Blind Visions, can be found at www.lulu.com. Most recently, he helped found BYP 100 NOLA, a young adult organization that advocates for the protection of Black youth from state-sanctioned violence.
Good afternoon. So, I don't know if that Bayou spoke to my work as much as it probably should have, but to speak directly to that, the piece I'm working on right now is a play called Crossroads. In terms of docudrama, which I understand is what you guys are studying right now, is very, can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
All right, good. It's very directly based on experiences I've had since 2007, since returning back to New Orleans from my college state of Tallahassee, Florida. And so since being back, I've witnessed a lot of the dynamics of I guess what can be termed as disaster capitalism. Anybody familiar with that term?
Nope. Just
Yeah.
give us a
Yeah, quick one on that. Read a book called Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. It's an excellent book that talks all about basically how capitalists take advantage of disasters. So disaster capitalism is exactly that, where you're talking about, Category 5 hurricane in the city, decimates the city, you got to build new businesses. Here's an opportunity for us to capitalize on this disaster, right? So it's either a natural disaster or a man-made disaster that big corporations quite often swoop in and take advantage of. So that is something that kind of informed my lens since I've been back in New Orleans. It was one of the first books I read, and even though it doesn't focus just on New Orleans, it starts off with a lens just basically on what she's observing as a Canadian journalist coming down, standing in some of those long lines that we had to stand in, and watching the way that our culture, well, first just geographically things were being taken from us, very directly, and so that geographic land grab situation transfers into, of course, everything that comes with the land, a culture grab situation. And so my play deals with, through a very specific lens of academia, and through a little glimpse at, and also just like an undergirding sub-theme of gentrification, and it shows how academic racism and gentrification play kind of hand in hand in a post-Katrina New Orleans environment especially. So the way it's docudrama oriented, I've got several family members, friends, cousins, what have you, who've all been through these similar type of situations. It follows one character named Menelik, who gets fired from his job, and it takes very aggressive, reaction to that. So it kind of tracks the litany of microaggressions that lead to an aggressive reaction, if that makes any sense. So that's that, and I'm open to questions.
Did you want to show a clip or something like that?
The clip is 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just,
I emailed the clip. You guys can check out howaround.com, and I'm sure we can get that to your professor. You guys can check it out. I also wrote a blog on there talking about my experience with the residency I did last summer at a spot called Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans. So y'all can check that out. If we have time in a second, maybe I can, a little bit of that clip, but it's really hard to put in context if you don't see the whole thing.
Sure.
So check it out. You get my email after this, and you can stay in touch.
So the fourth panelist is Alexis Skinner, who is an artist scholar who grew up in a black community theater, learning and practicing every aspect of stage at Goldsmiths University of London, and is currently a Louisiana Board of Regents, Southern Regional Education Board doctoral fellow, studying theater history at Louisiana State University. With a deep commitment to training young artists in theater performance and administrative practice, Alexis has performed, produced, taught, and directed for community and academic audiences. Currently, she is concentrating her research on developing successful and sustainable arts administration strategies for minority arts organizations. And Alexis is here today to talk about the Outworks Play Festival. It happens at LSU every year.
Do I have to come over there?
You can talk from there.
All right, hi everybody. Outworks is our LGBTQ Play Festival here on LSU's campus. We've actually been producing it for 10 years. This is year 10, and that's kind of a big deal considering when now Dr. Chris Krejci was a PhD student in the same program I'm in. He moved from Texas and found that there weren't a lot of theater opportunities or theater productions or even just conversations about theater and LGBTQ production. So what he did was he went to his advisors and said, hey, there's this thing I would like to do. And they worked with him and had the first Outworks, I guess that's exactly 10 years ago, 2005. And now we're 10 years later, we're still producing it with student performers, student directors, and I think it's a really important opportunity here on this campus to continue doing this work, because one of the things that we talked about in a forum last fall was that as a college population, we're always getting new people. We're always getting fresh eyes on the stage to learn what we're doing, especially because we have a target audience of the college population here at LSU. And one of the particular duties, I think, of theater practitioners is to look at the community around them and see how they can engage with them in meaningful ways. And I think Outworks has a particular role in doing so with our college population here. Because if something is familiar to you because you've been dealing with it for, let's say, the past 10 years, someone who's a freshman coming in this semester might not be as familiar, might not already know what you know. And so as particularly people in the theater department here at LSU, I think we have a particular role to work with people and to share information to people who may not already know it. And one of the things particularly about me and minority theater development, I think, is that as theater, mainstream American theater, as it changes over time, what you may have noticed, I don't know if some of you have been studying for a while, but some things don't ever change. Sometimes you're faced with opposition when you come from a minority perspective, whether it's your race, your gender, your sexual preferences, your lifestyle choices, whether or not you're steampunk, that's a minority, you know what I'm saying? So when theater is able to acknowledge and incorporate the minority perspective, theater is better afterwards. And that's one of the things that Outworks is trying to do, to make theater better. And as it relates to docudrama, theater was a media form before it was sort of what we call the theater, right? So theater had its place as the documentation of daily life and the documentation of the way that life should be. And so that's kind of how Outworks and theater still relates back to docudrama, which you guys are talking about today.
Great.
Do you mind if I get into really quickly?
Sure.
So also, thank you guys so much for making gestures for docudrama. I should also say that we just went through the big spread of like every kind of minority theater ever over the last couple, okay, maybe not ever, over the last few weeks. So you can feel comfortable that we just did GLBTQ Angels in America in our last class. The class before that, we just did feminist theater. Looking at Cloud9, the week before that, Eric actually came in and we talked about Latino theater and Chicano and New Yorker theater, and we read Anna in the Tropics, and the week before that we were talking about Amiri Baraka. So y'all are sandwiched quite conveniently into, and a lot of, I would say, sometimes awkward and uncomfortable conversations in this class about how all of those things function in our department. So you can feel free to also talk about those things. And I would also like to ask, the name of this panel is about microaggressions, right? And so I wonder,
it's kind of between, we're looking to bridge the session between microaggression and something that we could say, this is definitely systemic racism, systemic sexism, like in the criminal justice system, something like that, or in the education system. But it's really so as it branches that way. But I think where we want to start with the discussion is, how can it approach microaggression as sort of, this microaggression is more of the quotidian face of discrimination, things where people in their daily life feel discriminated against, and a lot of it comes out of internalized racism that happens on a psychological level, on a social psychological level. But I think, my own little hypothesis is that, just to throw it out there, that I think theater has a tremendous potential for addressing microaggression, since it is a daily life experience and we can dramatize that. But I'm sure that our artists who do this have some interesting insights on that too.
yeah, I wonder if you could take a couple of minutes to actually define, each of you in your own experience, a kind of difference between systemic racism, sexism, exclusionism versus microaggression, right? Just as a kind of super helpful.
Antonio, you can start.
Well, I'll go ahead.
I'm just gonna focus on the lens of my play. That's the best way I can do it. I would say systemic racism in the arena of academic racism, as I'm talking about it, or gentrification. We'll start with academic racism is an exclusion of narratives, right? Texas, for example, is the biggest purchaser of textbooks in the country, right? So when they already have a certain agenda that they want forwarded, and they decide that they're only going to buy textbooks to tell this story and not the ones that include the full story, that would be, in my definition, that's like systemic, right? But what's micro is when your coworker is in a meeting with you and you're planning a curriculum and you bring up something about Africa or a marginalized story that's not included for the most part, and the room goes silent, awkward, tense. Oh, but what about those saints? Whatever it is to change that's micro, right? And enough micro is obviously, it's just the leaves on a tree. You know, like the microaggression is the manifestation of the system, which is the tree, which is always holding that in place, and you see it manifest by way of people's behavior is because it's been internalized.
And as an artist, I think that it's difficult to decide how we can talk about it as microaggression, but sometimes microaggression is more like a macroaggression that's interactive. And I think you'll find that outside of classrooms, outside of air-conditioned environments, it's more likely to be something a little bit more blurry as to when it's, in terms of what the confrontation is. But as an artist, one of the things that you struggle with is that to keep perspective of systemic issues, and my show Men in Uniform is very much a looking at legal definitions of what racial profiling is along the U.S.-Mexico border, which pertains to people along the U.S.-Mexico border, which is different from the rest of the country, and which is not as discussed. And that very much ties nicely into talking about what Quess is saying. This is something systemic, and this is something interactive that speaks to the power of assumptions, of being able to control the microphone, and something much more untidy. My show I'm working on now, Mexican's Guide to the Middle East, begins with what you can describe as a tennis match of microaggressions between a Palestinian man and I, and deciding who gets to define the knowledge of, in his case, Mexican geography, and in my case, Palestinian geography. And so in this, you have two people who are in the map of power are very murkily slinging mud at each other for fun, and in a way that perhaps is like going to the gym to practice for a marathon for other kinds of confrontations. But so I think that when you're making art, for me, it's very difficult to once you start to censor yourself from these kinds of interactions, or in a place like New Orleans where this happens often with Black New Orleanians and immigrants, of Vietnamese immigrants or Mexican immigrants or Honduran immigrants, how do we talk about those interactions when they're confrontational in a way that keeps sight of a larger picture, but speaks to the complexity of what's going on in interactions? So I think that's something that I think about as an artist a lot.
I would say that there's a phrase that I use a lot in my research called institutional, and then insert racism, sexism here. And it's usually something that is based in law, it's based in social tradition and historical practice. But I think the systemic side is very much the overt, you are this, and therefore I'm going to deny you this because I have the power. And I come from the majority perspective, right? But the microaggressions, I think, are the internalized versions of the institutionalized practice. And what happens is that we subconsciously create stories and stereotypes and biases against others because of what we had no control over understanding or interpreting from the beginning.
I think this piece of theater is dealing mostly with social perceptions and what, specifically from Eve's point of view, is the idealized version of what a woman has to be based on media coverage and male expectation to behave, look, feel, think, do, and showing how that has sort of integrated into these women's systems that they are either not aware of or totally aware of, and then their own commentary on that. So I see it as like the broader issue being this is what you have to be, and their micro issue of saying I am aware of that, I understand it, but it's also hard to change because we all have this like, yes, I know that I shouldn't have to feel this way or be this way or look this way, but it's still, you're still seeing it everywhere. And it's interesting that this is done as a theatrical piece because I think the media and film has a lot to say about what women are and what women look like and what women do. And I don't know that it would work as well as a film piece, even if it could reach a broader demographic of people to say, let's act against this, because you would be seeing probably 5 or 1 or 12 women who are very tall and thin and beautiful in the conventional setting, like blonde, doing these stories instead of real live human being, not to say that they're not real, but you know, diverse looking, acting, breathing, age ranged, telling these stories of themselves. So it's interesting to see that it is done in a play setting instead, and maybe doesn't reach a broader demographic, but is still something that you can access with live people and have an interaction and maybe make a difference.
Can I build on that? I haven't really spoken to the importance of theater. I didn't say that in my intro either, but something about, and I do a multiplicity of genres, like I do hip hop, poetry, and all these different things. But what I felt from any one of those, and I'm not a screenplay writer, I haven't done that yet, but what I can say about theater is it makes you sit in a room with a thing more than anything else is going to make you sit in a room with a thing. And it brings real life right in front of you. You can abstract it as much as you want, or you can do what docudrama does, which I think is just like a hyper-realist version of theater. Like if you want to take the genre of hyper-realism where you make something so real you can't tell if it's a picture or not, to me it's still art if I have to watch that happen in front of me. And one of the tools that I use is something called the Story Circle, which comes from the Free Southern Theater Institute. Anybody familiar with that? Pardon me, I'm going to teach you. I'm going to ask every once in a while if y'all want give a little feedback. FSTI is one of the oldest outfits coming out of the South. It came out of the Civil Rights era by a man named John O'Neill and 2 other founders. And basically what they did was something that they and another theater company started. I think they were called Carpetbag Theater. And both of them use what we call a story circle. So you give someone a prompt to talk about something very real. They have 2 minutes to talk about it. Then we mirror each other and talk about what we saw that we identified with, what we saw that was brand new. And that's a window. So you use mirrors and windows. It's a great tool for any theater makers out there. And off of that you create monologues, dialogue, scenes, song, movement, what have you. And so no matter how much you abstract it, it's so rooted in reality that to sit in a room with that thing is going to, I think, affect people in a way that it's not on screen. I'm a big Spike Lee fan, but sitting in the room with something like a Jungle Fever, or whatever the movie was, or Bamboozled, would have done a lot more for me than just seeing it on the screen, because now I'm uncomfortable. And I don't know if those people really embody that or they're acting on what it is, but regardless, it's the human connection.
You see the reaction too, right? Like you feel the energy shift, and there's a dialogue between the people in the space. You could turn it off if you're just watching it on film.
Exactly.
There's no feedback, there's no mutuality.
I think we kind of organically, and thank you for that, Quess, moved right into the question. I sent all the panelists ahead of time, which is...
Which I unfortunately did not get to that, so.
Okay, no, that's fine. No, this is great. Which is why theater? Why are you, as an activist, drawing on theater to talk about these issues? Or as an artist, why do you think that theater needs to talk about these issues? So.
Yeah. I mean, I think I kind of hit on that a little bit already, but I think it is important to have a dialogue about what, especially because in our history of development of theater, there are very few plays that really feature women, as the protagonist. I mean, that's a broad generalization, but that have more female characters than male characters, that have 3-dimensional human beings on a stage instead of subservient to something else. And it's really interesting to see this play in reaction to the vagina monologues, which is more like orating a story. These monologues felt more real to me in a way that it was accessible to someone other than or other than a woman. So it's something that is still accessible and still interesting to anyone who comes to see it, even if it is a female point of view. And I know this isn't part of the panel, but writing my show for my thesis project, which was all characters from Greek mythology, all women, I confronted, is this going to be interesting? Is it going to be preachy? Is it going to be feminist theater that nobody's going to want to see because I'm telling a point of view that may be uncomfortable for someone? And why do I feel the need to censor myself and say, oh, I shouldn't do that because someone might not like it? I don't feel like that's a productive way to incite change, or it's too bad that I feel that way, because as a woman telling a story, I might not be interesting. But that's something that has been socialized in me, right? As an artist, as a woman, as an educator in this environment, that's something that I am hyper aware of. So making theater like that to say, no, I shouldn't have to be afraid to push back, and doing the good body is a great opportunity to sort of push back in a way that I may not have done before.
And so LGBTQ theater developed sort of, when we look at who came first, through the feminist theater practices, right? And one of the things that both feminist theater and LGBTQ theater were doing were challenging the narrative of what sexuality is and what people's expectations should be for others who are not themselves, right? And so the KISS is like a big convention in LGBTQ theater as a challenge, a direct challenge and an absolute threat to, I think, this master narrative, this mainstream narrative of what people should be and what people, versus what people actually are, right? People are along a continuum more than they are one thing or the other. And so I think the KISS was particularly used in LGBTQ theater to bring attention to, and to really sound the alarm that no, everyone's not doing the traditional thing, and everyone should be equally included in the practice. And in the space of a theater, like we said before, here, you can't escape, right? You can't run away from what you see in the same way that you could just turn off the TV or, put in a different movie that is giving you the traditional Hollywood ending, right? And there's two plays actually in Outworks that I just wanted to highlight. Wake Up Call, The X Commandments, and also Hoover in Love. So Wake Up Call, there is a story of a lesbian couple who are being harassed by somebody, prank calls, and breaking into their home and defacing their property. And while one partner is particularly reticent to confront this, the prank call, the microaggression, right? Because it shouldn't officially affect their lives, but it does. The other is a little more bold in her dealing head on with not only, respecting their property and lives and happiness, but also in using the words that had been insults, right, traditionally, to I guess reclaim control over those aggressions. And Hoover in Love has this self-censorship, which may be a self-microaggression, right? Because if you're in a position where you are the minority and you're surrounded by people who disapprove of you or do not understand or dislike your contribution, then you're going to hold back and you're going to keep things in. And so Hoover, you guys know J. Edgar Hoover?
Yes.
Yeah.
From Leonardo DiCaprio? Yeah, that's fine, that's cool. It doesn't matter. So he was a real person, and we have a script about Hoover in Love, right? So it's the meeting between him and Tolson and sort of their courtship through self-censorship in a state of absolute surveillance, which is, again, that speaks to our American experience right now, right? Gmail, Google, they're watching. You can't escape, but you still have to practice your own humanity. And theater gives you that opportunity to really see somebody else's humanity up close.
Well, why theater? I mentioned a little earlier that this show, where I was locked in the back of a Jeep, of a suburban Jeep, facing the desert in El Paso, and interrogated for a little over an hour, leaves you wanting to not sit in a room and type and backspace and type and backspace a confrontation, but rather relive it in a way where you can step out of the narrative, where you can give backstory, where you can give context that is political, or give confession that's personal as to why you think someone would want to do this to you, and why you know that as important as it is politically, it can also be swept under the rug. When the lawsuit that I brought to federal court came out, a 15-year-old boy from Tijuana was shot in the back as he was running away from a Border Patrol agent with a lead pipe, and he was offered $500. And if it made anything outside of Spanish language news or a few local publications, I wouldn't be able to tell you. But in reliving something like this in theater, not only do you have to confront the story, but at the same time, I get to try to make you complicit in ways that in ways that a teacher does. You don't understand, you don't have the background for this, let me give you background information. You do have background into this, let's be complicit. Let's find analogies that make us connected. So as a performer, for me, it's also the act of translating myself, as I already am in many ways. New Orleans, why did I imagine the parade as an important form to take on in a city like New Orleans, where you think of representational politics as I studied it when I was in your seats. How do I put that on the street? How do I translate the idea of a king and a queen? Of course, obviously, the ideas of alternatives to this idea of Rex from Zulu was crucial, but also smaller parades like Crew de Jew. I saw that a bumper sticker before I knew the existence of this parading organization called Crew de Jew, which is a Jewish Mardi Gras crew that, if you think about it, Mardi Gras is a Christian holiday, so where Jews were excluded from, just as blacks were. How do I translate the idea of royalty to the idea of if in the picture that I had up earlier, there was a Benito Juarez who was swinging a piñata that was in the year of the swine flu epidemic that was in Mexico. I made a piñata of a pig that was being destroyed in front of the statue of Benito Juarez, who's the person who came as a laborer, as a political exile, and who's being represented by this character, Ram Gopal Mattu. Behind is Maximilian, who's a black woman in whiteface, who was the emperor, and there's this long backstory of the history of Maximilian and Benito Juarez. And also how to make a parade where that's me, where I'm simultaneously this hypersexual macho character, but also an infantilized cartoon character from Mexican cartoons, and turned into this skipping, jumping, mustachioed, bare-chested fairy. And how does that play out when, as you're skipping in the street and you see not just the world stopping still, but you see the entire world moving. If you're in a parade and the parade is moving, you see a microcosm of the world. And as you're seeing that, people are responding to you in ways that reproduce all kinds of micro and macro aggressions, and that you throw and throw back as flowers, teasing right back. Yes, if an old lady makes a sort of homophobic comment, what do? Grab her and give her a big, sexy kiss on the cheek. So there's a cleansing that happens in the street that is very different from what happens in a theater. But both of these things are performances.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, why don't we open it up to questions then, from students and maybe also panelists if you guys have a question for each other. Let's start in the back.
I have a question for Alexis about Outworks. So you addressed the play that I'm in and Sarah's directing. And I was curious as to, you stated that you thought one of the characters dealt with the issue directly and the other one sort of used the caller's words to sort of fight back at him. But I guess that like we had sort of thought of it in different terms, that like my character, like I thought that I guess both of the characters used his words against him, and Maj's character was more unwilling to deal with it head on. So I don't know, I guess I wanted a little bit of clarity on that, as to also like which character you thought did which thing.
Not the words of the caller, but the words, the swear words, right? I don't know how comfortable you all are with language, but language is a really critical issue when you look at microaggressions in particular. And if you think about the words that people call people that they just don't like, right? And then the words that they call people that they want to threaten, versus the words that they call people that they want to belittle. Like, the words are very particular, and some words are used more than others.
So you're talking about sort of like the power of the words he has, that the Vandal has written on my art, and then like why we choose to continue to bring those up throughout the play, like the
Yes.
importance of that. Okay, cool, thank you.
You brought this up, but I'm opening up to the whole panel. Earlier, you, I may be generalizing, equated some of the interactions that you had, microaggression, to a form of going to the gym, and I was wondering if making that type of equation, does that mean that exclusion and aggression is a form of social exercise with the purpose of conditioning and toning a minority to be stronger against exclusion and aggression, or do you think it's to condition and tone and keep a minority within a box?
I guess maybe.
I'll directly, I think there is the room in the context that I was talking about last with parading, and this may be controversial, but my own personal feeling about it is that there is some, either in the incident or in the reflection of it, or in the fantasy of it, some room for transcendence.
Definitely, like that's a very huge thing that I like. We were studying inquiry theater. We're talking about like underage sex and talking about revelations going through like sexual trauma. And I was wondering if like any of you other artists had something similar to that in your experiences working on shows, because I know that those were themes in a lot of the things that you guys are working on.
That's a really amazing question. Can you rephrase it a little bit more so I can know clearly what I'm responding to if I'm responding?
The idea that if you go through enough interactions and enough trauma that you will become stronger out of it, or do you think if you go through that trauma that it's going to keep you tied up in the idea of sloth?
I don't know. I honestly don't know personally. I think that depends on the person and how they respond to it and the kind of support that they have. And maybe it is a reaction. I know Eve Ensler in her play, in this play, briefly mentions, but not very clearly, that she was sexually abused by her father in one of her monologues, but doesn't spend time talking about it in this play. But other characters do mention that that is something that they encountered. And I think telling that story maybe helps be relatable, right? Because at the end of the day, the things that we're the most scared of are the things that we sometimes want to hide behind and say, I never want to say this out loud because I won't be loved, or I won't be accepted, or I won't be this or that. And then as soon as you feel comfortable to say it or confront it and do admit that there's someone who might come up and say, thank you for saying that to me, I had the same experience.
Exactly.
And so there is empowerment in some ways by speaking the words aloud. But these characters that Eve was creating are played by people who may not have had those experiences. So I don't know. I think it kind of depends on the person and the artist, how much, what the reaction might be.
I think another way to maybe think about that question too is by approaching and representing microaggressions in theater. I like the way you said, Antonio, I like the way you said there's a chance to escape, where there's some kind of microaggression that can happen, is that always the case, or do we run the risk of reproducing that violence in bringing people to confront things that may be painful, for example?
I was really struck by, you possess it?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was really struck by what Alexis said about the kiss being like a motif in queer theater, because in black arts theater, which would be what informs me most, I would say it's the fist. If not the fist, it's just the analysis. And I think there's this really powerful, negatively powerful reduction that happens to the humanity of people who go through an excessive amount of microaggressions. To say that it, builds you up like an athlete at the gym, I think kind of ignores the piece of how it really reduces your accessibility to just, not having muscle. Just like be loose and flabby, be out of shape, be vulnerable, you know what I mean? Talking to a friend of mine about the way my play is reading to her, as I just kind of floated out there to friends this past week, she was like, yeah, he seems like a caricature of someone, and I keep getting that word, right? And I tell her that, when I look at Spike Lee's movies, everybody looks like caricatures to me. But what you have is a series of caricatures that are like pawns on a chessboard, and eventually the truth is therein, in the play between those caricatures, and they kind of checkmate that truth to come out. But it does negate your ability to show somebody outside of these roles, especially, and it's unfortunate in a genre that we're talking about documentation and realism. But part of what happens in the process of silencing someone is that, again, when we're talking about a lot of those more, I guess, alternative manifestations of your expression as a human being don't come across because you have a very regimented agenda about how you're going to get at least point A out. I can't even discuss the fact that like Africa was a thing for like 20,000 years before white supremacy. Okay, if I can't get that point out, then there's a whole lot of other queerisms, and I don't mean bisexuality, but I mean queerism in terms of queering the color line, queering just identity, period, that really do exist within, these marginalized communities. But, I thought Summer was a great feat, but we're still telling the same story. You know what I mean? Because we didn't even get that right, right? So a part of what I feel happening in my piece is, the kiss we don't get to the kiss so much, right? We don't get to explore as much of the vulnerability and, the really nuanced humanity that you would like to see from a lot of these silenced voices. It's just enough work to get the analysis out there. You guys dealt with Mayer-García, and you've seen The Dutchman, and you've read The Dutchman, and a part of what you see happening there is he was happy to be in 1960s America saying, I have an analysis about what you've done to me, right? That's what James Baldwin announced when he showed up in the 50s and the 60s is, there will be no more white supremacy or white America. That day is done. We're here now, baby. You got something to say. And this is how we're going to say it. And that's really an accomplishment so much in and of itself that a lot of those little subcategory stories, it takes a long time for them to get out. And yet the truth is so vast and so intricate and complicated. Africa is a continent, first of all. It's not a country. Simone didn't get that yet. But she's been to every continent in Africa. You should see it. Anyway, and there's so many stories therein, and then there's so many stories therein within the pantheon of Black America. It's one little subset of that diaspora, right? And yet, it's hard enough to even get a story to the stage. So what I did in one of my scenes, after he's going through all the microaggressions, he watched him be silenced. It's kind of like an Invisible Man kind of narrative. At the beginning of the second act, he's going into a bizarro dream state, and he doesn't speak anything fluid. It's all just like poetry. And some people had an issue with, well, what is he saying? I don't get it. But people who had an ear for what he was making allusion to get it. And what he's alluding to is all of this muddled, quieted history, which there's a picture of it. I'll show y'all later. But he's in an interaction with a developer who's telling him his history back and telling him, that's fine and dandy. You were great once. When you get off your, off your ass and stop acting like a homeless vagabond, I'll hire you after he's been fired. You know what I mean? So I'll appropriate your Black intelligence to help, feed my system. If you ever see a movie called Trick Baby, right? Look that YouTube clip up, and it has the same exact conversation at a table that is full with just, I guess, a modern day reincarnation of the plantation dynamic. Black people are serving them as white liberals versus a white conservative, discuss how they're going to control the Black mass. So it's that thing. And it's really great to be in a conversation with people who are having, because if you listen, the indices, the psychological indices beneath everything that we're saying, it's pretty much the same thing. Unfortunately, my play manifests as the usual fist, because you're still just trying to have a basic analysis, a basic conversation, and it's not being, introduced.
Well, we're out of time, so I just want to thank our panelists. Please help me thank our panelists. And thank you, Dr. Shannon Walsh, for letting us have this forum in your class.